Welcome to my new Building with Ben series where I do DIY tasks around the homestead that aren't necessarily garden related. In this episode, I'm installing a handrail for our kitchen door, but it's much more complicated than you might think, so stick around and take a look at what I'm building this week. It's a nice day here on the homestead. We're starting to get some warmer weather. I've been focusing a lot on the crops, as you've seen in my previous garden update, but there's other projects we need to work on here, such as this part of the house. Several years ago, when I first bought the property, I had to do a lot of tweaking of some stuff, like there were rotten staircases, the well pump had to be redone, holes in the roof, things like that. So I built this using some stringers from Home Depot. And I plan to reuse this wood, but I'm going to take it down because you can see there's a lot of rotten siding around there. I also need to put up a railing to make it a bit safer. So I'm going to go ahead and demolish everything that's there, try to salvage as much material as I can, and then I'll see what I can do. What you'll probably hear from a lot of renovation specialists is that homeowners can save a good bit of money by doing the demolition phase of any renovation project themselves. Well, for me, in this house, which is over 100 years old, the demolition is always very tricky. Any sort of nails or fasteners like screws that I find are fully rusted and they're just kind of dissolving inside of the wood. Or on the flip side, the nails are so huge that I need to use like some sort of giant iron bar just to break them off. This has a mixture of things like that. You can see here there's some rusty nails, very annoying to take out, but that log that's acting as the sill plate on this house is basically rotten all the way through, but it does have some structure left, and it's not really something I can take out because they don't make lumber this dimension anymore that I could simply replace it with. So basically what I'm doing, just to squeeze a few more years out of this area, is I'm beefing it up, basically filling in the gap with framing that I'm custom cutting out of old growth pine, and then I'm just going to use pressure treated lumber, which I'm assuming they didn't have when they actually built this, to act as a shell around the threshold of this door. So I cut a pressure treated 2x material, and I'm basically fastening it to the framing that I added in the cavity of the old log. And as you can see here, I'm just doing a quick job of putting some house wrap over this just because there's a rainstorm coming up and I want to make sure all the water gets repelled from the house. But this is not the permanent solution for shedding rain away. Once the rain passed, I decided to actually start on the permanent rain deflection, which is this custom ripped piece of roofing metal, much thicker gauge than the sort of flashing spool that you typically get at the store. But I did use regular flashing just as a place under the threshold. That way I could easily bend it, basically doing a shingle method where you think like water and you want to overlap anywhere that water could get in and deflect the water away from the house. So that's what this pattern is here. Now I use this pressure treated material as basically the top step of the staircase, but what it actually is the threshold piece that the trim piece attaches to. You can see me installing it there with some fresh screws. This allows all the water to shed away from the house. Ideally, it won't even touch the metal that I've secured to the house, but in case it gets behind the siding, that metal is there as a backup. I'm cutting squares out of cypress clapboard so I can use it in a reverse pattern to essentially shim out the existing cardboard clapboard that my house has. That way I can have a flush surface to mount a 2x4 to the wall. This wall-mounted 2x4 is going to act as the mechanism where I secure my handrail to the house. And to wrap up the cypress strips, I just put some silicone sealant between the seams. My next step was to start digging a hole for the vertical post. It's a pressure treated 4x4, and that's going to hold the bottom of the handrail in place permanently. I actually have a gas-powered auger, which would typically make this a breeze, but I was not able to use it because of the amount of bricks that were located underground, just in the way of where the post needs to sit. You can see now I have a 12-foot 2x4, which I essentially wedged in the ground on one side, attached to the house on the other. That way I could hang the new 4x4 post in place to make sure it was level and it would not fall over. My next step was to dump the bag of concrete and mix it with water in the wheelbarrow. Then it's as simple as dumping it in the hole and making sure that the grade slopes away from the post. You don't want water pooling around the post because then it can rot prematurely. I let that first pour set overnight, but I wasn't satisfied because it was too shallow underground and I wanted a thicker slab of concrete holding the post in place. So I bought a bag of quickset concrete this time, and I essentially just mixed it in the hole, brought it up to close to ground level, but not quite, but it's plenty of weight to hold this thing in place. This area was never graded particularly well, so I'm going to use all of the dirt that I dug out of the hole to put back in that area, try to make sure there's a good slope away from the wood post as well as away from the house. Next, I flipped the stringer set back to where it was before. This already had a gap around the pavers, so that was the easiest thing to do. This time, however, I can use large decking screws to secure the stringer to the 4x4 post. I made sure the stringers were level left to right, but I did want to have a downward slope away from the house to shed water. I recycled the old steps and I flipped most of them over so they would look more fresh. But the bottom one, I forgot to do that, and I had already notched it, so that's why that bottom one looks a bit discolored. I did a quick coat of white paint and primer on these cypress strips, and that's basically just to make sure they're sealed from the elements before that 2x4 goes on. And then I used a scrap 2x4 as a guide to simulate the slope that the handrail would be in the future. Next, I cut and install a pressure-treated 2x4 as the permanent handrail. So if you remember, that vertical 2x4 is essentially connecting the handrail to the house. So I used these 6-inch structural screws to make sure it was into the load-bearing stud of the house. Next comes some quick cleanup and grading, and to move the pavers back into place. I did replace the siding to the right of the door, just in case you were concerned about the waterproofing of that. I did that off camera because, frankly, I just didn't have time to get the equipment out. But I'll show you a photo of the finished product.